The night Lena Carver's brothers sold her for $300 and a stack of worthless poker chips, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood in that filthy saloon with rope burns cutting into her wrists and made herself a promise. Whoever bought her would regret it. The man who stepped forward wasn't what she expected. Rhett Calder. A name spoken in whispers. A rancher feared across 3 territories. He looked at her once, nodded, and walked out. And Lena realized something worse than cruelty waited for her. A man who saw her as nothing at all. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lena's story travels. And if you're ready to see what happens when a woman refuses to stay broken, hit that like button and let's ride. The saloon smelled like piss, whiskey, and defeat. Lena had been standing against the back wall for 2 hours, hands bound behind her, while her eldest brother Cyrus worked the room like a carnival barker. His voice carried over the drunk laughter and clinking glasses, selling her virtues like she was a plow horse at auction. "Strong back," he was saying, bourbon slurring his words. "Good teeth. Never been sick a day. Do laundry, mending, cooking. Hell, she can birth calves if you need it." Someone laughed. Someone else spat tobacco juice that splattered near her feet. Lena kept her eyes on the far wall, on a watermark shaped like a crooked cross. She'd been looking at it so long the edges had started to blur. If she looked at Cyrus, if she looked at middle brother Eugene leaning against the bar with his arms crossed, watching this happen, she'd break. And she couldn't afford to break. Not yet. "300, a voice called from the corner. Older man, gut hanging over his belt. "But I want to see her smile first. Make sure she's got all them teeth you're bragging about." Cyrus turned to her, grinning. "You heard the man, Lena. Give him a smile." She didn't move. "Lena." His voice dropped into something colder. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Go to hell." The words came out quiet, but they cut through the noise like a knife. The room went still for half a second, then erupted into whoops and hollers. Someone banged on the bar. Cyrus crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and backhanded her across the face. The crack echoed. Her head snapped sideways, cheek exploding in heat. She tasted copper. "Apologize," he said. Lena worked her jaw, spit blood onto the floorboards between them, and met his eyes. "No." For a moment she thought he'd hit her again. His hand twitched, but then Eugene pushed off the bar and put a hand on his shoulder. "Easy," Eugene muttered. "Damage the goods and nobody's buying." Cyrus shook him off but stepped back. He turned to the room, spreading his arms wide. "See? Spirit? That's worth something, ain't it? A woman with fight in her won't just roll over when things get rough." "I'll give you $250, someone called. "But only if she comes with a bill of sale saying she won't run." $275, another voice countered. "And I don't care if she runs. I'll just bring her back." Lena's vision was still swimming from the hit, but she forced herself to focus. This was happening. Actually, happening. Her brothers, bloodkin, were selling her to strangers because Cyrus had gotten drunk 3 nights ago and lost their dead father's ranch in a card game to a man named Bickle, who ran the biggest saloon in Red Hollow Bend. Bickle had given him 1 week to pay up or forfeit the land. Cyrus had chosen option 3, sell his sister. $300, a new voice said from the doorway. The room went quiet. Lena turned her head, slow, because sudden movement made the room spin, and looked toward the entrance. A man stood silhouetted against the fading daylight outside, tall, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low enough that she couldn't see his face. He didn't step inside, just stood there, taking up the whole doorframe like he owned it. Cyrus's grin faltered. "That you, Calder?" The man didn't answer right away. He stepped into the saloon and the light hit him. Lena had heard the name Rhett Calder before. Everyone in 3 territories had. He owned land north of Red Hollow Bend, thousands of acres carved out of raw frontier, bordered by mountains on one side and a river that ran red with clay on the other. People said he'd killed a man in a duel over a water claim. People said he'd lost his wife and child to fever and hadn't spoken for a year afterward. People said a lot of things. Looking at him now, Lena believed most of them. He was maybe 35, face weathered like old leather, jaw shadowed with stubble. His eyes were pale, gray or blue, hard to tell in the dim light, and they swept the room once before landing on Cyrus. $300, he repeated. "Cash. Now." Cyrus licked his lips. Well now, Mr. Calder, I appreciate the offer, but we were hoping to get a bit of a bidding war going here. $350, Rhett said flatly. Final offer. You waste my time again and I walk. Eugene shot Cyrus a look. Cyrus hesitated, then nodded fast. Sold. She's yours. Bill of sale, Rhett said. Don't got one written up yet. Then write it. Rhett pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the nearest table. Use that. Your name, her name, the amount. Witnessed and signed. Cyrus scrambled for the paper like a dog after scraps. Eugene fetched a pen and ink from behind the bar. It took them 5 minutes to scrawl out the transaction, hands shaking so bad the letters looked like spider legs. 2 men Lena didn't recognize signed as witnesses. Rhett counted out the money without looking at it. $350 in bills and coins, stacked on the bar. Cyrus reached for it, but Rhett's hand clamped down on his wrist. Understood, Rhett said quietly. Cyrus swallowed. Understood what? You don't come near her again. You don't write. You don't ask for money. She doesn't exist to you anymore. Sure, whatever you say. Rhett held his gaze for another 5 seconds, then released him and picked up the bill of sale. He folded it, tucked it into his coat, and finally looked at Lena. His expression didn't change. Can you walk? He asked. It was the first time anyone had spoken directly to her in 2 hours. Lena's throat was dry as dust, but she managed, Yes. Then let's go. He turned and walked out. Lena stood there, hands still bound, staring at the empty doorway. Around her, the saloon was already moving on. Someone called for another round. A card game resumed in the corner. Cyrus pocketed the money and avoided her eyes. Eugene stepped forward and cut the ropes around her wrists with a pocket knife. For what it's worth, he muttered, I'm sorry. Lena looked at him, at his weak chin and his coward's eyes. No, you're not, she said, and walked out after Rhett called her. Outside, the sky was bruising purple, the sun a red wound on the horizon. The street was mostly empty, just a few drunks leaning against storefronts and a dog nosing through garbage. Rhett was waiting beside a horse, a big roan gelding with a notched ear. He didn't look at her as she approached, just checked the saddle straps, tugged the reins, adjusted the saddlebags. Lena stopped a few feet away, rubbing her wrists where the rope had cut in. The skin was raw, already bruising. I don't have a horse, she said. I know. I don't have anything. I know that too. He swung up into the saddle, then extended a hand down toward her. Lena looked at it, looked at his face. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just waiting. She took his hand. His grip was strong, calloused. He pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion, and she had to grab his coat to keep from sliding off the other side. The horse shifted beneath them, snorting. Hold on, Rhett said, and kicked the gelding into a trot. They rode out of Red Hollow Bend without another word. The first hour passed in silence. Lena kept her hands fisted in the back of Rhett's coat, trying not to think about how close she was pressed against a stranger, trying not to think about anything. The landscape blurred past, scrub brush and red rock, patches of wild grass turned silver in the fading light. The air smelled like sage and dust. Her cheek throbbed where Cyrus had hit her. She could feel it swelling, the skin tight and hot. When full dark settled in, Rhett finally slowed the horse to a walk. Lena's legs were cramping, her back aching from sitting so stiffly. There's a creek a mile ahead, Rhett said without turning around. We'll stop there for the night. All right. Another silence. You got a name? He asked. Lena Carver. You know mine? Everyone knows yours. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. I suppose they do. They reached the creek just as the moon rose, a thin crescent that barely lit the ground. Rhett dismounted first, then helped Lena down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the dirt, but she locked her knees and stayed upright. Rhett unsaddled the horse and led it to the water. Lena stood there, useless, watching him work. He moved with the kind of efficiency that came from doing the same task 1,000 times, loosening straps, checking hooves, running a hand along the horse's neck. When he was done, he pulled a bedroll from the saddlebags and tossed it to her. You sleep there, he said, nodding toward a spot near a scraggly cottonwood tree. I'll take first watch. Watch for what? Anything. He didn't elaborate, just settled down on the opposite side of the small clearing, rifle across his knees, and stared out into the dark. Lena stood there for a moment, holding the bedroll. Then she walked to the tree, spread it out, and sat down. Her whole body hurt. Her face hurt. Her heart hurt. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "You should sleep," Rhett said from across the clearing. "I'm not tired." "You will be tomorrow." Lena didn't answer. She rested her chin on her knees and watched the creek glint in the moonlight. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote howled. Another answered. "Why'd you buy me?" she asked. Rhett was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Needed a hand." "You could have hired someone." "Hiring means they can leave." Lena's stomach went cold. "And I can't?" "No." The word hung in the air between them, flat and final. Lena looked at him, really looked. He was still staring out into the dark, face unreadable in the shadows. "What happens if I try?" she asked quietly. Rhett turned his head and his eyes caught the faint moonlight. "Don't." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was just a fact, delivered in the same tone someone might say, "Sky's blue." Lena's hands tightened around her knees. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to wake up and find out this was all some nightmare. Instead, she said, "All right." Rhett looked at her for another moment, then turned back to his watch. Lena lay down on the bedroll, pulled the thin blanket over herself, and stared up at the stars. They were scattered across the sky like broken glass. She didn't sleep. They rode for 3 more days. Rhett set a brutal pace, up before dawn, riding until dusk, stopping only to water the horse or choke down some jerky and hardtack. Lena's legs went numb from gripping the horse's sides. Her hands blistered from holding on to Rhett's coat, her face scabbed over, the bruise spreading down to her jaw. Rhett didn't talk much. Sometimes he'd point out a landmark, a rock formation, a dry riverbed, a stand of pine trees. Mostly he just rode. On the 3rd night, they crested a ridge, and Lena saw it. The ranch. It spread out below them like a kingdom, a sprawling valley ringed by mountains, a river cutting through the middle of it. She could see buildings in the distance, a main house, a barn, corrals, smaller cabins scattered around the perimeter. Cattle dotted the landscape, dark shapes against the grass. "That's it," Rhett said. Lena stared. It was bigger than she'd imagined, wilder. "How much land?" she asked. 15,000 acres, give or take. She didn't know what to say to that. They rode down into the valley as the sun set, painting everything gold and red. By the time they reached the main house, full dark had fallen. A man stepped out onto the porch as they approached, older, maybe 60, with a gray beard and a limp. He squinted at them. "That you, boss?" "It's me, Hank." Rhett dismounted and helped Lena down. Her legs nearly gave out, but she managed to stay upright. "This is Lena. She'll be working this ranch." Hank looked at her, then at Rhett, then back at her. His expression didn't change. "All right. Get her set up in the spare cabin. She'll need work clothes, boots, whatever else." "Yes, sir." Rhett handed the reins to Hank and turned to Lena. In the lamplight from the porch, she could see the lines around his eyes, the tiredness in his face. "You start tomorrow," he said. "Sunup. Don't be late." "What am I doing?" "Whatever needs doing." He walked past her into the house and shut the door. Lena stood there, swaying on her feet, every muscle screaming. Hank cleared his throat. "Come on, then. Let's get you settled." She followed him across the yard to a small cabin set back from the main buildings. Inside was sparse: a cot, a wash basin, a single chair. A lantern hung from a hook on the wall. "I'll bring you some clothes in the morning," Hank said. "There's water in the basin. Outhouse is round back." "Thank you." He nodded and left, shutting the door behind him. Lena stood in the middle of the cabin, listening to his footsteps fade. Then she walked to the cot and sat down. The mattress was thin, the blanket rough, but it was hers. For the first time in 3 days, she let herself cry. Sunup came fast. Lena woke to someone pounding on the door. She jerked upright, disoriented, her body stiff and aching. "You got 5 minutes," a voice called from outside. She stumbled to her feet, splashed water on her face from the basin, and opened the door. Hank was standing there with an armful of clothes, canvas trousers, a faded work shirt, a pair of boots that looked like they'd seen better days. "These'll do for now," he said, handing them over. "Get dressed and meet me at the barn." He walked off before she could answer. Lena shut the door and changed as fast as her sore muscles would allow. The clothes were too big. She had to roll the pant cuffs and cinch the belt tight, but they were sturdy. The boots fit well enough. She stepped outside into a world painted gray and pink with dawn. The air was cold, sharp in her lungs. Somewhere a rooster crowed. The barn was easy to find, a massive structure that smelled like hay and horses and manure. Hank was inside, saddling a mare. "You ride?" he asked without looking up. "Some." "Good enough. You'll be checking the fence line on the north pasture today. Anything broken, you mark it. Don't try to fix it yourself." "Why not?" "Because I said so." He finished with the saddle and handed her the reins. The mare was a sweet-faced thing, brown with a white blaze. Lena ran a hand along her neck. "What's her name?" "Daisy." "Hey, Daisy." The mare huffed and nosed at her pocket, looking for treats. Hank pulled a coil of rope and a bag of stakes from a shelf and tied them to the saddle. "You know how to mark fence posts?" "No." He showed her how to tie a red cloth strip around the broken section, how to hammer a stake into the ground nearby so it was easy to spot. "North pasture's about 2 miles out. Follow the river. You'll see the fence." "All right. And Lena?" She looked at him. His eyes were sharp beneath the bushy brows. "Don't wander. You get lost out there. Ain't nobody coming to find you till nightfall." "I won't wander." He grunted and walked off. Lena led Daisy outside, climbed into the saddle, and kicked her into a trot. The north pasture was bigger than she'd expected. The fence stretched for miles, rough-hewn posts connected by barbed wire that sagged in places. Lena rode slowly, scanning for breaks. The sun climbed higher, and the air warmed. Sweat soaked through her shirt. She found the first broken section around mid-morning, 2 posts leaning sideways. The wire snapped. She dismounted, tied a red cloth around the nearest post, and hammered a stake into the ground. Moved on. By noon, she'd marked 6 breaks. Her hands were blistered from the hammer, her shoulders burning. She stopped to rest in the shade of a cottonwood, sharing her canteen with Daisy. The land stretched out in every direction, empty and endless. No people, no buildings, just grass and sky and the far-off mountains. Lena leaned against the tree and closed her eyes. She thought about her brothers, about the ranch she'd grown up on, smaller than this, scrappier, but it had been home. Her father had died 2 years ago, and everything had fallen apart after that. Cyrus drank. Eugene followed him like a shadow. And Lena had tried to hold it together, working herself to the bone, but it hadn't been enough. It was never enough. She opened her eyes and looked at the bruise on her wrist where the rope had cut in. It was turning yellow at the edges, fading, like she was fading. No. She pushed off the tree and climbed back onto Daisy. She wasn't going to fade. Not here. Not anywhere. She finished the fence line just before dusk and rode back to the ranch. Hank was waiting by the barn. "How many?" he asked. 11 breaks. He nodded, took Daisy's reins, and handed Lena a bucket. "Pump's over there. Fill it and bring it to the chicken coop." She hauled water until her arms shook, fed the chickens, mucked out 2 stalls in the barn. By the time Hank finally told her she was done, the stars were out, and her whole body felt like it was on fire. "Dinner's in the main house," he said. "You eat with the men." Lena's stomach clenched. "I'd rather not." Wasn't asking. He walked off. Lena stood there, filthy and exhausted, then trudged toward the main house. Inside, the main room was crowded. 8 men sat around a long table, shoveling food into their mouths and talking over each other. The air smelled like stew and bread and unwashed bodies. A woman, middle-aged, sturdy, with her hair tied back in a bun, was ladling stew from a pot on the stove. Everyone went quiet when Lena walked in. She stood in the doorway, acutely aware of how she must look. Bruised, blistered, covered in dust. Rhett was sitting at the head of the table. He glanced at her, then back at his plate. "Sit." Lena walked to the nearest empty chair and sat down. The woman brought her a bowl of stew and a hunk of bread without a word. The men went back to talking, but Lena could feel them watching her from the corners of their eyes. She ate slowly, keeping her head down. The stew was good, thick with meat and potatoes. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. You finished the north pasture? Rhett asked. Lena looked up. Yes. How many breaks? 11? One of the men whistled low. 11? Hell, that fence is falling apart. We'll fix it tomorrow, Rhett said. He looked at Lena. You did good. It wasn't praise exactly, just a statement of fact, but something in Lena's chest loosened a fraction. She nodded and went back to her stew. After dinner, she walked back to her cabin and collapsed onto the cot without even taking off her boots. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. The days blurred together after that. Lena worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, feeding livestock, hauling water, mucking stalls. Her hands toughened, her muscles stopped screaming. The bruise on her face faded to nothing. The men mostly ignored her. A few nodded when she passed. One, a younger guy named Tom with a scar through his eyebrow, offered to help her lift a feed sack once. She told him she could manage, and he shrugged and walked off. Rhett she barely saw. He was always somewhere else, riding the property, meeting with buyers in town, dealing with things she didn't understand and wasn't asked about. When they crossed paths, he'd nod or ask a brief question about her work, and that was it. She told herself she didn't care, told herself this was just a job, just survival. But at night, lying in her cabin, she couldn't stop thinking about the bill of sale, about the word sold, about the fact that she wasn't here by choice. And she couldn't stop thinking about what Rhett had said that first night. Hiring means they can leave. And I can't? No, she'd been bought, owned. The thought made her skin crawl. 3 weeks in, everything changed. Lena was in the barn, brushing down Daisy after a long ride, when she heard voices outside. Loud, angry. She set down the brush and stepped into the yard. Rhett was standing near the main house, facing off with a man Lena didn't recognize. Short, stocky, dressed too fine for ranch work. Behind him were 2 other men, both armed. I don't care what you think you're owed, Rhett was saying, voice low and dangerous. You're not getting it. You signed a contract, the man shot back. 600 head by the end of the month. We had a deal. And I told you the herd got hit by fever. I can deliver 400. That's it. 400 doesn't cover my costs. Not my problem. The man stepped closer, jabbing a finger at Rhett's chest. You think you can screw me over and walk away? You think... Rhett moved so fast Lena almost missed it. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, and slammed him face first into the dirt. One of the armed men went for his gun, but Rhett had his own pistol out and cocked before the man's hand even touched the grip. Next person moves gets shot, Rhett said calmly. Nobody moved. The man on the ground groaned. Rhett kept his boot on the back of his neck. You come onto my land, Rhett said quietly, and you threaten me, and you think I'm just going to roll over? You don't know me very well. This isn't over, the man spat. Yeah, it is. Get out. Rhett stepped back, and the man scrambled to his feet, red-faced and furious. He jerked his head at his men, and they backed toward their horses, guns still half drawn. You're making a mistake, the man called over his shoulder. Wouldn't be the first time. They rode off, kicking up dust. Rhett stood there, watching them go, pistol still in his hand. Then he holstered it and turned, and saw Lena standing in the barn doorway. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rhett said, You see that? Yes. You tell anyone? Who would I tell? He studied her, then nodded. Good. He walked into the house and shut the door. Lena stood there, heart pounding, and realized something she hadn't before. Rhett Calder wasn't just hard. He was dangerous, and she was tied to him now, whether she liked it or not. The next morning, Lena woke to find a rifle leaning against her cabin door. She stood there in her bare feet, staring at it. A Winchester, well-oiled, stock-worn smooth from use. A box of ammunition sat beside it. No note, no explanation. She picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, empty, and carried it inside. Set it in the corner by the wash basin and got dressed for the day. When she walked to the barn, Hank was already there, measuring out grain for the horses. Boss left that for you, he said without looking up. Why? Didn't say. But if I had to guess? He straightened, fixing her with that sharp look of his. He figures you ought to be able to protect yourself. From what? From whatever comes. Hank went back to his work, and Lena stood there feeling the weight of those words settle into her bones. That afternoon, while she was hauling water to the vegetable garden behind the main house, she saw Rhett standing on the porch with 3 of his men. They were looking at a map spread across a makeshift table, arguing about something she couldn't hear. Rhett's jaw was tight, his arms crossed. One of the men, a lean guy named Carson with a mustache that drooped past his chin, jabbed a finger at the map. If Vance is sending men to survey the northern border, he's planning something. We need to know what. We don't have enough hands to watch every inch of fence line, another man said. Not with the branding coming up. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, then said, Double the night watch, 2-man teams. And I want someone riding the property line every day until we know what Vance is up to. That's the bastard from yesterday? Carson asked. That's him. Should have shot him when you had the chance. Rhett's expression didn't change. Maybe. Lena turned away before they could notice her and carried the water bucket to the garden. She dumped it into the irrigation trench and went back for another load, but her mind kept circling back to what she'd heard. Vance, the man from yesterday, the one Rhett had thrown into the dirt. She'd thought that was the end of it. Apparently not. By the time evening came, the ranch felt different, tighter. Men moved with purpose, checking weapons, saddling horses for night patrol. The woman who cooked, Lena had learned her name was May, started putting extra food on the table, like she was expecting trouble and wanted everyone fed while they could be. At dinner, Lena sat in her usual spot near the end of the table and kept her head down. The men talked in low voices about fences and cattle and whether Vance had enough men to make a real move. Rhett barely touched his food. Halfway through the meal, Tom leaned over and said quietly, You know how to use that rifle the boss gave you? Lena looked at him. His scar pulled tight when he frowned, making him look older than he probably was. Some, she said. Some ain't good enough. You want, I can show you after dinner. Make sure you can hit what you're aiming at. Why would you do that? Tom shrugged. Because if things go sideways, we need everyone who can shoot to actually shoot. Lena glanced down the table at Rhett. He was listening to Carson talk, but his eyes flicked toward her for just a second, then away. All right, she said. After the plates were cleared, Tom led her out past the barn to a stretch of open ground where someone had set up a row of old bottles on fence posts. The sun was nearly down, the sky streaked orange and purple. Tom handed her the Winchester. Let's see what you got. Lena loaded the rifle, raised it to her shoulder, sighted down the barrel. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, mostly rabbits and the occasional coyote that got too close to the chickens. But that had been years ago, and her hands weren't as steady as they used to be. She squeezed the trigger. The bottle exploded. Tom let out a low whistle. Some, huh? Lena lowered the rifle, surprised. Got lucky. Do it again. She did. Hit the second bottle dead center. By the time she'd shattered all 6, Tom was grinning. Hell, you shoot better than half the men here. Don't tell them that. Why not? Because I don't need them looking at me any different than they already do. Tom's grin faded. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. They walked back toward the cabins in the gathering dark. Lena could see lanterns burning in the bunkhouse, hear the low murmur of voices. Somewhere a harmonica played, slow and mournful. Can I ask you something? Tom said. You can ask. How'd you end up here? Lena didn't answer right away. She thought about lying, about making up some story that didn't involve her brothers, or a saloon, or a bill of sale. But what was the point? I got sold, she said. Tom stopped walking. Sold? By my brothers, to your boss, for $350. He stared at her, and she watched his face cycle through shock, anger, confusion. Jesus, that's the truth. Does Rhett know? He's the one who bought me. Tom looked like he'd been punched. Why the hell would he do that? You'd have to ask him. She kept walking, leaving Tom standing there in the dark. When she reached her cabin, she locked the door, set the rifle by the bed, and lay down fully clothed. Sleep didn't come easy. She kept thinking about Tom's face, about the way he'd looked at her like she was something broken. Maybe she was. But broken things could still be sharp. The next week was brutal. Rhett pushed everyone harder. Longer hours, heavier work, constant vigilance. Lena found herself assigned to new tasks every day. One morning she was repairing a collapsed section of the corral. The next she was helping May slaughter and dress chickens for the week's meals, her hands slick with blood and feathers. The day after that, Hank had her riding fence line again, this time armed and watching for signs of trespass. She didn't see any, but the tension on the ranch didn't ease. Men started sleeping in shifts. Rhett barely slept at all, as far as Lena could tell. She'd see him late at night, standing on the porch with a cigarette, staring out at the dark. And she'd see him at dawn, already saddled and riding out before most of the men were awake. One afternoon, Lena was in the barn organizing tack when she heard boots on the floorboards behind her. She turned. Rhett stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. He looked tired, deep lines around his eyes, stubble heavier than usual. "You got a minute?" he asked. "Sure." He stepped inside, glanced around like he was checking to make sure they were alone. Then he said, "Tom told me what you said, about how you ended up here." Lena's stomach tightened. "And? And I wanted to make sure you understood something." "What's that?" Rhett met her eyes. "I didn't buy you to own you. Could have fooled me. I know how it looks, but the truth is your brothers were going to sell you to someone, and most of the men in that saloon," he shook his head, "they wouldn't have treated you right. So you're a saint now." "No, I'm a man who needed help and saw an opportunity. But I'm not going to pretend I saved you, Lena. I didn't. I just made a different kind of deal." She studied him, trying to read past the hard mask he wore. "What kind of deal?" "You work, you earn your place here. And when you've worked off what I paid, you're free to leave." Lena felt something crack open in her chest. "How long?" "A year? Maybe less if you work fast. And then I can go?" "Anywhere you want." She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she believed him, but the fact that he'd said it at all, that he'd come here to say it, meant something. "All right," she said finally. Rhett nodded. He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing." "What?" "You're good with that rifle, better than I expected. So from now on, you're armed when you ride out. And if you see anyone you don't recognize on this land, you get back here and you tell me. Understand?" "Yes." "Good." He walked out, and Lena stood there in the dim barn, heart pounding. A year. She could survive a year. 2 days later, everything went to hell. Lena was out on the eastern pasture, checking a water trough that had been running dry, when she heard the gunfire. 3 shots, rapid, from the direction of the northern fence line. Then silence. Her blood went cold. She grabbed the reins of her horse, a gelding named Rusty, and swung into the saddle, kicked him hard. He lunged forward, hooves pounding the dry earth. The fence line was a mile away. Lena rode flat out, rifle bouncing against her back, wind tearing at her hair. She crested a low rise and saw them. 2 of Rhett's men, Carson and a kid named Pete, were pinned down behind an overturned wagon. 4 men on horseback circled them, firing intermittently. One of the riders had a torch. Lena didn't think. She pulled the rifle free, reined Rusty to a stop, and fired. The man with the torch jerked sideways and fell from his horse. The torch hit the ground and sputtered out. The other 3 riders spun toward her, and Lena's brain caught up with what she'd just done. She'd just shot a man. One of the riders raised his pistol. Lena kicked Rusty and dropped low over his neck as a bullet whined past her head. She fired again, missed, worked the lever and fired a 3rd time. This one hit. The rider's horse reared and he tumbled backward into the dirt. Carson and Pete used the distraction to scramble out from behind the wagon and return fire. One of the remaining riders went down. The last one turned his horse and bolted. Lena sat frozen in the saddle, ears ringing, hands shaking. Carson ran over, face flushed, eyes wild. "You all right?" Yeah, I think so." "You just saved our asses." Pete jogged up, younger, maybe 19, breathing hard. "Who the hell are you?" "She's with us," Carson snapped. "That's all you need to know." He looked at Lena, and something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or just recognition that she wasn't what he'd thought she was. "We need to get back," he said. "Now. Before more show up." They rode hard for the ranch, the three of them, leaving the bodies where they'd fallen. Lena's mind was screaming, but her hands were steady on the reins. When they reached the main house, Rhett was already outside, rifle in hand, face like granite. "What happened?" he demanded. Carson dismounted and gave him the short version: ambush at the fence line, 4 riders, likely Vance's men. He jerked his head toward Lena. "She showed up and dropped 2 of them. Saved our hides." Rhett looked at Lena. She looked back. For a long moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then Rhett said, "Get inside, all of you." They gathered in the main room: Rhett, Carson, Pete, Hank, Tom, and Lena. May hovered in the kitchen doorway, worry etched into every line of her face. Rhett paced in front of the fireplace. This was a probe. Vance wanted to see how we'd respond. Now he knows. "So what do we do?" Tom asked. "We don't wait for him to hit us again. We hit him first." Carson frowned. "With what?" "We've got maybe 12 men who can shoot. He's got 30, easy." "Then we make up for numbers with planning." Rhett stopped pacing and looked at each of them in turn. "We know where his operation is, that ranch he bought last year, south of Kettle Creek. We know he's overextended, and we know he's expecting us to sit here and wait." "You want to raid him?" Pete said, voice cracking a little. "I want to make it clear that coming after my land is a mistake he won't live to repeat." Hank cleared his throat. "That's a declaration of war, boss." "War's already started. We're just choosing to fight it on our terms." Lena sat in the corner, still holding her rifle, listening. Her heart was still racing, her hands still shaking, but she forced herself to stay quiet. Rhett glanced at her. "You did good today." "I shot 2 men." "You protected my people. That's what matters." "Is it?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. The room went silent. Rhett's expression didn't change. "Yes." Lena wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she'd never killed anyone before, that she could still see the man falling from his horse, the torch hitting the ground. But she swallowed it all down and nodded. "All right," she said. The meeting broke up. The men filtered out, talking in low voices. May disappeared into the kitchen. Rhett stayed by the fireplace, staring into the cold ashes. Lena stood up to leave, but he said, "Wait." She stopped. He didn't look at her, just kept staring at the fireplace. "I need to know if you're in or out." "In or out of what?" "This, all of it, because it's going to get worse before it gets better, and I can't have anyone on this ranch I don't trust." Lena thought about the year he'd promised her, about the bill of sale tucked away in his office, about the fact that she had nowhere else to go. "I'm in," she said. "Why?" "Because you gave me a choice. That's more than most people have done." Rhett finally looked at her, and for just a second the hard mask slipped. She saw something underneath, grief maybe, or exhaustion, or just the weight of carrying too much for too long. Then it was gone, and he was just Rhett Calder again. Untouchable, unreadable. "Get some rest," he said. "We move in 2 days." Lena walked out into the night, and the stars overhead were cold and sharp as broken glass. The next 2 days were chaos. Rhett drilled the men relentlessly, shooting practice, riding drills, going over the plan until everyone knew their role. Lena found herself included without question, assigned to ride with Carson and Tom on the left flank. May cooked enough food to feed an army, packing saddlebags with jerky and hardtack and anything else that would keep. Hank checked every horse, every saddle, every weapon, and Rhett barely spoke. He moved through the preparations like a man going to his own funeral, focused and distant. The night before they were supposed to ride out, Lena couldn't sleep. She got up, pulled on her boots, and walked out to the corral. The moon was nearly full, painting everything silver. She leaned against the fence, watching the horses shift and snort in the dark. "Can't sleep either?" She turned. Tom was standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets. "Guess not," she said. He came over and leaned on the fence beside her. "You scared?" "Terrified." "Good. Means you're smart." They stood in silence for a while. Then Tom said, "You know, I didn't think much of you when you first showed up. Figured you were just some girl Rhett had picked up on a whim. And now? Now I'm glad you're on our side." Lena didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Tom sighed. "For what it's worth, I think what your brothers did to you was about the lowest thing a man can do. And I'm sorry it happened. It's not your fault. I know, but I'm still sorry. He pushed off the fence and headed back toward the bunkhouse. Lena watched him go, then looked up at the stars. Tomorrow, she'd ride into a fight that wasn't hers, for a man who'd bought her, on land she had no claim to. And yet, she thought about the way Rhett had given her a rifle, the way Carson had looked at her after she'd saved him, the way May always made sure there was enough food on her plate, the way Hank had shown her, patient and gruff, how to do 100 different tasks. This place wasn't home, but it was starting to feel like it could be. Lena went back to her cabin, lay down, and this time sleep came. They rode out at dawn. 12 men and Lena, armed and grim-faced. Rhett led the way, his jaw set, eyes forward. They moved fast and quiet, cutting across open country toward Kettle Creek. The plan was simple. Hit Vance's ranch hard and fast, scatter his men, burn his barns, and make it clear that the cost of continuing this fight was higher than he was willing to pay. It was also insane, but no one said that out loud. They reached the ridge overlooking Vance's ranch just after noon. Below, the spread was smaller than Rhett's, but well-maintained. 2 barns, a main house, a scattering of outbuildings. Men moved between the structures, going about their work. Rhett studied the layout for a long moment, then turned to the group. Carson, you take the left. Tom, you take the right. Hank, you're with me on the center. We go in fast, fire the barns, and get out. Anyone shoots at you, you shoot back. But we're not here to kill unless we have to. Understood? Everyone nodded. Lena, Rhett said, looking at her, you stay on the ridge. Anyone tries to flank us, you give us cover. I can fight, she said. I know, but I need someone watching our backs more than I need another gun down there. She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about doubting her. It was about keeping her alive. All right, she said. Rhett held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded. Let's move. They rode down the ridge in a thunder of hooves, and Lena positioned herself on a rocky outcrop with a clear view of the ranch. She watched as they hit the place like a storm. Rhett and his men scattering Vance's crew, torches flying, flames licking up the sides of the barns. Gunfire cracked through the air. Men shouted, horses screamed. Lena kept her rifle trained on the chaos below, finger resting on the trigger. Then she saw them. 3 riders coming up the far side of the ridge, trying to circle around behind Rhett's position. She didn't hesitate. She fired, worked the lever, fired again. 1 rider went down. The other 2 pulled up short, realizing they'd been spotted. They turned and bolted. Lena kept firing until they were out of range, then scanned the area for more threats. Below, the barns were fully engulfed now, black smoke billowing into the sky. Rhett's men were already pulling back, regrouping. And then Lena saw him. Vance. He stepped out of the main house with a rifle aimed at Rhett's back. Lena's heart stopped. She swung her rifle around, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. Vance fired. Rhett jerked sideways, grabbed his shoulder, but stayed in the saddle. Carson wheeled his horse around and returned fire, driving Vance back into the house. Lena was already running, sliding down the ridge, rifle clutched in both hands. By the time she reached the bottom, Rhett's men were surrounding him, checking the wound. I'm fine, Rhett was saying through gritted teeth. It's just a graze. But blood was soaking through his shirt, dripping onto the saddle. Lena pushed through the group. Let me see. Rhett looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. But he didn't argue. She pulled his shirt aside. The bullet had carved a furrow through the meat of his shoulder, deep but clean. You need stitches. Later. We need to move. You're bleeding too much. I said later. Lena tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt and wrapped it tight around his shoulder, knotting it hard. Rhett hissed, but didn't pull away. That'll hold for now, she said. But you push it, and you'll bleed out before we get home. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. All right. They rode back to the ranch at a slower pace, Rhett swaying slightly in the saddle, the makeshift bandage already soaked through. No one spoke. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only exhaustion and the sinking realization of what they'd just done. When they finally reached home, May was waiting on the porch. She took one look at Rhett and said, "Inside, now." Lena helped him down from the horse and into the house. May had already set up her sewing kit on the kitchen table. Out, May told the men crowding the doorway. All of you except Lena. I need someone to hold him down. The men filed out. Rhett sat heavily in a chair, face pale. May cut away his shirt and examined the wound. You're lucky. Another inch and it would have hit the bone. Feels real lucky, Rhett muttered. May threaded a needle. Lena, hold his arm. Lena moved behind him and gripped his upper arm. She could feel him trembling, whether from blood loss or pain, she couldn't tell. May started stitching. Rhett didn't make a sound, but his muscles went rigid under Lena's hands. It took 20 minutes. When May finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound properly, Rhett sagged forward, breathing hard. You need to rest, May said. I need to make sure Vance doesn't retaliate tonight. Rhett, I'll rest when this is over. He stood, swayed, and Lena caught his good arm. You're not riding anywhere tonight. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something close to vulnerability in his eyes. I can't afford to be weak right now, he said quietly. You're not weak. You're bleeding. There's a difference. For a moment she thought he'd pull away, insist, push past her like he always did. Instead, he nodded. All right. May helped him to his room. Lena stood in the kitchen, staring at her hands. They were covered in his blood. She washed them in the basin, watched the water turn pink, and wondered what the hell she'd gotten herself into. Outside, night had fallen hard and fast. Lena stood on the porch, rifle in her hands, watching the darkness beyond the lantern light. The men had posted guards at every corner of the property, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Everyone knew Vance wouldn't let this go. The only question was when he'd hit back. Carson came up the steps, his face streaked with soot. How's the boss? Stitched up. May's got him resting. That'll last about 5 minutes. Carson pulled out a cigarette, struck a match. The flame lit his face for a moment before he shook it out. Hell of a day. Yeah. You did good out there. Real good. Lena didn't answer. She kept seeing Vance stepping out of that house, raising his rifle, kept seeing her shot go wide. If Carson hadn't been there, stop, Carson said. What? Whatever you're thinking, stop. You gave us cover on that ridge. You kept those flankers from blindsiding us. And you got Rhett back here alive. That's what counts. I missed. Everyone misses? You think I hit every shot I take? He took a drag, exhaled smoke into the cold air. The difference between you and most people is you keep pulling the trigger anyway. Lena looked at him. In the lantern light, his face was hard but not unkind. How long have you worked for him? 6 years, since right after his wife died. What was she like? Carson was quiet for a moment. Kind. Too kind for a place like this. She got sick one winter, fever, and by the time they could get a doctor out here, it was too late. Took their baby girl with her. Lena felt something twist in her chest. How old was the baby? 3. The word hung in the air between them. He hasn't been the same since, Carson said. Used to smile sometimes, laugh even. Now? He shook his head. Now he just works, builds, fights. Like if he stops moving, he'll remember what he lost. Lena thought about the way Rhett looked at the land, the way he drove himself and everyone around him. Not cruelty, just a man trying to outrun ghosts. Why'd you stay? She asked. Because he needed someone to, and because this place is worth fighting for. Carson flicked the cigarette into the dirt and crushed it under his boot. You'll see that too, eventually. He walked off toward the barn, leaving Lena alone with the night and the weight of everything she'd learned. She stayed on the porch until her legs ached, then finally went back to her cabin. She lay down fully clothed, rifle within reach, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep came in fits and starts, full of gunfire and falling men and Rhett's blood on her hands. When dawn broke, she was already awake. The next week moved like a held breath. No attack came. No riders appeared on the horizon. But the silence felt worse than violence, like the world was waiting for something to crack. Rhett emerged from his room on the second day, pale but functional, his arm in a sling May had insisted on. He immediately started giving orders, checking defenses, riding the property line despite May's protests. You're going to tear those stitches, she told him. Then you'll sew me up again. Stubborn fool. But May's eyes were soft with worry, and Rhett saw it. He put his good hand on her shoulder. I'm all right. No, you're not. But you're too hard-headed to admit it. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Lena watched the exchange from across the yard, something uncomfortable stirring in her chest. She'd spent so long thinking of Rhett as the man who'd bought her, the man who held her bill of sale, that she'd forgotten to see him as just a man. Flawed, haunted, trying to hold together something bigger than himself. That afternoon, Hank pulled her aside. Boss wants to see you in his office. Lena's stomach dropped. What for? Didn't say. She walked to the main house, boots heavy on the wooden steps. Inside, the office was small and cluttered, maps on the walls, ledgers stacked on the desk, a gun cabinet in the corner. Rhett sat behind the desk, writing something in a ledger. He looked up when she entered. Close the door, he said. She did. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying her. His shoulder was bandaged beneath his shirt, the sling hanging loose around his neck like he'd been ignoring May's orders. I've been thinking about what you said, he started. About the year. Lena's pulse quickened. And? And I think we need to make some changes. Her hands tightened into fists. You're going back on your word. No. I'm saying you've already earned more than I expected. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folded paper. The bill of sale. He set it on the desk between them. You've worked harder than most men I've hired. You've fought when you didn't have to. You saved lives, including mine. Lena stared at the paper. What are you saying? I'm saying the debt's paid. You're free to go whenever you want. The words hit her like a punch. Free. The thing she'd wanted since the moment Cyrus shoved her into that saloon. The thing she'd been counting down to. So why did it feel like the ground had just dropped out from under her? Just like that? She said. Just like that. And if I stay? Rhett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Then you stay as a hired hand. Same pay as the men, same respect, no bill of sale, no debt. Just work. Lena looked at the paper on the desk. She could take it, burn it, walk away, and never look back. But where would she go? Back to Red Hollow Bend, where her brothers had sold her. To some other town where she'd be just another woman with no money and no prospects? Or stay here, on land that was starting to feel familiar, with people who'd begun to see her as more than a burden. I need to think about it, she said. Take your time. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Lena. She looked back. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I hope you stay. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and walked out. That night, Lena sat on the edge of her cot, the bill of sale in her hands. She'd taken it from Rhett's office on her way out. He hadn't stopped her. The paper was worn at the creases, her name written in Cyrus's shaky hand. $350. That's what she'd been worth to him. She thought about burning it, about tearing it into pieces and scattering it to the wind. Instead, she folded it carefully and tucked it into the bottom of her trunk. Not because she wanted to keep it, but because she wanted to remember where she'd come from. And she wanted to remember that she'd survived it. The decision came easier than she expected. By morning, she knew. She found Rhett in the barn, checking the horses. His sling was off again, and he was favoring his good arm, but otherwise moving normally. I'm staying, she said. He looked up from the stall he'd been examining. You sure? No, but I'm doing it anyway. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Fair enough. But I want something in return. The smile faded. What? I want you to teach me everything. How to run a ranch, how to manage the books, how to deal with buyers, all of it. Rhett studied her for a long moment. Why? Because I'm tired of just surviving. I want to know how to build something. He nodded slowly. All right, we start tomorrow. And they did. Over the next month, Rhett taught her things she'd never imagined needing to know. How to read brands and spot altered marks. How to calculate fair market value for cattle. How to negotiate with buyers without getting cheated. How to manage a crew of men who didn't want to take orders from a woman. That last part was the hardest. Some of the men accepted her easily. Carson, Tom, Hank. Others grumbled and dragged their feet, testing her at every turn. One afternoon, a hired hand named Jess refused to follow her orders about moving a herd to the south pasture. I take orders from Rhett, he said, crossing his arms. Not from some girl playing rancher. Lena felt every eye in the yard turn toward them. This was a test. Not just from Jess, but from everyone watching. She stepped closer. Rhett gave me authority to run this crew. You got a problem with that? Take it up with him. But right now, you're wasting daylight and my patience. Or what? Or you can pack your gear and get off this land. Jess laughed. You can't fire me. Watch me. She turned and walked toward the house, knowing he'd either follow or fold. Behind her, she heard Carson say quietly, I'd listen if I were you, Jess. She's already shot 2 men. You want to be the third? Silence. Then the sound of boots on dirt. Jess caught up to her halfway across the yard. All right, I'll move the herd. Lena stopped and looked at him. Good. And Jess? Next time I give an order, you follow it the first time. We clear? He nodded, jaw tight. She walked back to the crew and said, Let's move. They moved. That night, Rhett found her on the porch. He handed her a cup of coffee and sat down beside her. Heard about what happened with Jess, he said. You going to tell me I was too hard on him? No, I was going to say you handled it right. Lena sipped the coffee. It was bitter and strong, the way she'd learned to like it. He's going to make trouble. Probably. But now the others know you won't back down. That's worth more than one hired hand's pride. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars come out. Can I ask you something? Lena said. Go ahead. Oh, why'd you really buy me? And don't give me that line about needing a hand. You could have hired anyone. Rhett was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Because I saw something in you. The way you stood there in that saloon, bloodied and bound, and you still wouldn't break. I thought... He stopped, shook his head. I thought if you could survive that, you could survive anything, including this place. And was I worth $350? He looked at her, and in the dim light, she saw something raw in his expression. You're worth a hell of a lot more than that. Lena's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Rhett stood. Get some rest. We've got a long day tomorrow. He walked inside, and Lena sat there alone, the coffee cooling in her hands. The attack came 3 weeks later on a night when the moon was dark and the wind was howling. Lena woke to the sound of gunfire and men shouting. She grabbed her rifle and ran outside in her bare feet, her nightshirt tangling around her legs. The barns were on fire. Flames shot into the sky, sparks swirling in the wind like deadly snow. Men ran in every direction, some trying to free the panicked horses, others returning fire at the shadows beyond the light. Lena saw Rhett near the main house, rifle in hand, shouting orders. She ran toward him. How many? She yelled over the noise. At least 20, maybe more. They hit us from 3 sides. A bullet whined past her head, and she dropped into a crouch. Rhett pulled her behind a water trough. You need to get to safety, he said. Like hell. Lena, I'm not hiding while your ranch burns. Another volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line. One of the men near the barn went down, clutching his leg. Tom dragged him toward cover. Rhett looked at her, and she saw the war in his face, between keeping her safe and needing every gun he had. All right, he said. You're with me. Stay low, and don't do anything stupid. They moved together through the chaos, returning fire, covering the men trying to save the horses and cattle. The heat from the fire was intense, the smoke choking. Lena's eyes burned and her lungs ached, but she kept moving. Then she saw him. Vance. He was on horseback at the edge of the firelight, directing his men. Even from a distance, Lena could see the satisfaction on his face. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. This was revenge. She raised her rifle, sighted down the barrel. But before she could fire, someone tackled her from the side. She hit the ground hard, the rifle flying from her hands. A man loomed over her, his face twisted with rage. He raised a knife. Lena grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it in his eyes. He stumbled back, cursing, and she scrambled for her rifle. Her fingers closed around the stock just as he lunged again. She swung the rifle like a club. It connected with his skull with a sickening crack, and he dropped. Lena stood there shaking, staring at the man crumpled at her feet. Then Rhett was beside her, pulling her away. You all right? Yeah, I'm fine. But her voice was shaking and her hands were numb. The fight raged for another hour. By the time Vance's men finally retreated, 2 of the barns were destroyed, half the horses were scattered, and 3 of Rhett's men were wounded. But they'd held. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Lena stood beside Rhett, both of them covered in soot and blood that might or might not have been their own. "We need to end this," Rhett said. His voice was rough from smoke. "Before he burns everything to the ground." "How?" He looked at her, and she saw something dangerous in his eyes. "We go to town. We get the law involved. We make sure everyone knows what Vance has done." "You think the sheriff will help?" "I think if enough people see what's happening, Vance won't have a choice. He's got businesses in town, reputation to protect. We make this public. We make him answer for it." Lena nodded. "When do we leave?" "Soon as the men are patched up." May had set up a makeshift hospital in the main house, stitching wounds and wrapping burns. Lena helped where she could, holding men down while May worked, fetching water and clean rags. The man she'd hit with her rifle hadn't gotten up. Tom had dragged him away from the fighting and checked for a pulse. "He's alive," Tom had said, "but he's not waking up any time soon." Lena had nodded and turned away, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. By mid-morning, they were ready to ride. Rhett, Carson, Tom, Hank, and Lena. 5 people against a man with an army. But they were going to try anyway. The ride to town took most of the day. They arrived at Red Hollow Bend just as the sun was setting, painting the dusty streets in shades of red and gold. Lena hadn't been back since the night Rhett bought her. Looking at the saloon where it all started made her stomach turn. They tied their horses outside the sheriff's office and went inside. The sheriff was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and tired eyes. He looked up from his desk as they entered. "Calder." "Wasn't expecting to see you." "We need to talk about Vance," Rhett said. The sheriff sighed. "What'd he do now?" "Burned 2 of my barns, shot 3 of my men, and tried to kill me. Twice." "You got proof?" "We've got one of his men tied up in my barn. We've got witnesses, and we've got burn marks all over my land." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "Vance claims you attacked him first, burned his barns, scattered his herd, says he was defending himself." "That's a lie." Maybe, but it's his word against yours, and he's got more money to throw around." The sheriff's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Look, I know you're a good man, Calder, but this is a range war, and unless one of you kills the other, there's not much I can do." "So you're just going to let him burn me out?" "I'm going to suggest you 2 find a way to settle this that doesn't involve more bloodshed, because if this keeps up, I'll have to arrest both of you." Rhett's jaw tightened. For a moment, Lena thought he might hit the desk, but he just nodded once and walked out. They stood on the street outside the sheriff's office, the anger radiating off Rhett like heat. "Now what?" Carson asked. "Now we go see Vance," Rhett said. "Face to face. End this." "That's insane," Tom said. "He'll shoot you on sight." "Not if we do it public, in the saloon, with witnesses." Lena's blood went cold. "Rhett, it's the only way. We can't keep fighting like this. Someone's gonna die." "Someone already almost did. You." He looked at her, and his expression softened just slightly. "I know. But if I don't finish this, it'll never end, and I won't let him take everything I've built." Before anyone could argue, he started walking toward the saloon. They had no choice but to follow. The saloon was crowded, men drinking, playing cards, a piano in the corner, plinking out a tune. Conversations died as Rhett pushed through the doors. Vance was at a corner table surrounded by his men. He looked up, saw Rhett, and smiled. "Well, well," Vance said, standing. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show your face here, Calder." "We need to talk," Rhett said. "I'm listening. Outside." "Why?" "So you can ambush me again?" "So we can settle this without burning down half the territory." Vance laughed. "You think I'm interested in settling? You cost me 2 barns and half my herd. I'm interested in making you pay." "I'll buy out your land," Rhett said. "Fair price, cash. You take the money and move on." The saloon had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching. Vance's smile faded. "You think this is about money?" "Isn't it always?" "No, this is about respect. You humiliated me in front of my men. You burned my property, and now you think you can just throw some cash at me and make it go away." He stepped closer. I'm going to destroy you, Calder, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. Rhett's hand moved toward his gun. Vance's men moved too, hands dropping to their weapons. And Lena realized, with a sickening clarity, that this was about to turn into a bloodbath. She stepped between them. "Stop," she said. Every eye in the saloon turned to her. Vance looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's tired of watching men kill each other over pride." "This doesn't concern you, girl." "It does when I'm the one who's been cleaning up your mess." Lena looked at Rhett, then back at Vance. "You want to settle this? Fine, but do it fair. No ambushes, no burning barns, just the two of you." "A duel?" Vance said, sounding amused. "A horse race." The saloon erupted in murmurs. "A race?" Vance repeated. "Winner takes the loser's land. Clean. Final. No more blood." Rhett grabbed her arm. "Lena, what are you doing?" "Ending this," she said quietly. "Before you get yourself killed." Vance considered, his eyes narrowing. "And if I win?" "You get Rhett's ranch. All of it." "And if he wins?" "You leave. Take your men and go. Forever." Vance looked at Rhett, then back at Lena. Then he smiled. "All right. I accept. 3 days from now, Canyon Run to Kettle Creek. First one across the creek wins." Rhett's grip tightened on Lena's arm. "I didn't agree to this. But I'm curious to see if you will," Vance said. "Because if you don't, everyone in this town will know you're a coward." Rhett's jaw worked. Lena could see the calculations running behind his eyes. The risk, the stakes, the impossibility of walking away now that the challenge had been made public. Finally, he said, "Fine. 3 days?" Vance's smile widened. "I'll see you at the canyon." He walked out, his men following. The saloon exploded into conversation. Rhett turned to Lena, his face dark. "Outside it," he said. "Now." They stepped into the street. The sun had fully set now, and the lanterns were lit, casting long shadows. "What the hell were you thinking?" Rhett demanded. "I was thinking you were about to get shot. So you bet my entire ranch on a horse race?" "Yes." "Without asking me?" "You weren't exactly in a position to think clearly." Rhett stared at her, his chest heaving. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. It was a bitter sound, but it was a laugh. "You're out of your mind," he said. "Maybe. But at least you'll live long enough to call me crazy." He shook his head, still half smiling despite the anger in his eyes. "If I lose, you won't. You don't know that. I know you're the best rider I've ever seen. I know your horses are faster than his, and I know you won't let him take everything you've built." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You have a lot of faith in me." "Someone has to." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them was ready to name. Finally, Rhett said, "We should get back. We've got 3 days to get ready." They rode out of town under a sky full of stars, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just wagered everything on a man who'd once bought her like livestock. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being the man who owned her, and started being the man she'd chosen to stand beside. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of a fresh wound. Lena stood on the porch, watching the men tend to the horses, their movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. Carson limped past, favoring his left leg. Tom had a gash above his eyebrow that May would need to stitch later. Everyone looked like they'd been through a war. Maybe they had. Hank came up the steps, stopped beside her. "Boss asleep?" "I think so." "Good. He needs it." Hank pulled out a tobacco pouch and rolled a cigarette with practiced ease. "You did good out there today." "I missed." "You warned us. That's what mattered." Lena crossed her arms, feeling the weight of the rifle still pressed against her spine, even though she'd set it inside. "Hank, how long has this been going on? Between Rhett and Vance?" Hank lit the cigarette, took a long drag. "Year and a half, maybe 2. Started small. Disputed water rights, cattle wandering across property lines. Normal frontier bullshit. But Vance, he's got ambitions, wants to build an empire, and Rhett's land sits right in the middle of where he wants to expand. So this won't end until one of them's dead, or broke, or smart enough to back down." Hank looked at her through the smoke. My money's on dead, though. He walked off, and Lena stood there as the last of the light bled out of the sky. She went to check on Rhett around midnight. May had left a lamp burning low in his room, and Lena could hear his breathing before she even reached the doorway. Rough, uneven. She pushed the door open quietly. He was lying on top of the covers, still dressed except for his boots, one arm thrown over his eyes. The bandage on his shoulder was clean, but she could see the tension in his body, the way his jaw was clenched even in sleep. Lena started to back out, but he said, "I'm awake." She froze. "Sorry, I was just checking on me." "I know." He lowered his arm and looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was all shadows and hard angles. "You don't have to." "May asked me to." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Rhett sat up slowly, wincing. "How bad was it out there, after I got hit?" "We got out clean. No one else wounded." "Vance?" "Holed up in his house. Didn't come back out." Rhett nodded, rubbing his good hand over his face. "He'll retaliate. Maybe not tonight, but soon." "I know." He looked at her then, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. "Why are you still here?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you could have run. When we hit Vance's place, when everything went to hell, you could have taken a horse and been gone, and no one would have caught you." Lena leaned against the doorframe. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere. You're not a prisoner here, Lena." "Aren't I?" The question hung between them. Rhett stood up, moved to the window. Outside, the night was full of stars and the distant sound of horses moving in the corral. "I told you before. You work off what I paid, you're free." "I meant it." "And I told you I'm in. I meant that too." He turned back to her, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something else, but he just nodded, and the moment passed. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." Lena left him there and walked back to her cabin through the dark, and she realized something that made her chest tight. She didn't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The retaliation came 3 days later, and it came hard. Lena woke to the sound of cattle screaming. She bolted upright, grabbed the rifle, and ran outside in her bare feet. The eastern sky was just starting to lighten, but she could see the chaos even in the pre-dawn gloom. The herd was stampeding. Hundreds of cattle pouring across the main pasture like a flood, trampling fences, scattering in every direction. And behind them, riding hard, were men with torches. Vance's men. Someone was shouting orders. Rhett, she realized, already mounted and racing toward the herd. Other men were scrambling out of the bunkhouse, half-dressed, weapons in hand. Lena ran for the barn, didn't bother with a saddle, just threw a bridle on Rusty and swung onto his back. She kicked him hard and he shot forward, hooves pounding. The stampede was worse than she'd thought. Cattle everywhere, eyes rolling white with terror, some already down and being trampled by the others. The men with torches were trying to drive them toward the river. If the herd hit the water at full speed, half of them would drown or break their legs in the rocky shallows. Lena didn't think. She just rode. She cut in front of the herd, screaming, firing her rifle into the air. Rusty danced sideways, almost went down, but she kept him moving. A few of the lead cattle veered away from her, confused, and she pressed the advantage, forcing them to turn. Other riders joined her, Tom on one side, Carson on the other. Together they started to bend the stampede, turning it away from the river, slowing it. But the men with torches weren't giving up. One of them rode straight at Lena, torch raised like a weapon. She swung the rifle up and fired. The man jerked back, dropped the torch, and fell. Another rider came at her from the side. She tried to turn Rusty, but he was blown, couldn't move fast enough. The rider grabbed her arm and yanked. Lena hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of her. She rolled, gasping, and the rifle was gone, somewhere in the dust and the chaos. The rider dismounted, drew a knife. Lena scrambled backward, searching for a weapon, anything. Then Rhett was there. He rode in like hell itself, his horse slamming into the other man's mount and sending both man and animal sprawling. Rhett was off his horse before it even stopped moving, gun in his good hand, face twisted with rage. He fired twice. The man with the knife didn't get up. Rhett turned to Lena, grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet. "You hurt?" "No, Get on my horse. Now." She didn't argue. She climbed up and Rhett swung up behind her, his injured arm wrapped around her waist. He kicked the horse, and they rode hard back toward the center of the chaos. The stampede was slowing now, the cattle scattered but no longer running. Rhett's men were rounding up the stragglers, checking for injuries. Bodies littered the ground, some cattle, some men. The air smelled like gunpowder and blood and fear. Rhett pulled up near the barn and dismounted, then helped Lena down. His face was pale under the dirt and sweat, his bandage soaked through with fresh blood. "You're bleeding again," Lena said. "Don't care." "Rhett, I said I don't care." He looked past her, scanning the destruction. "How many did we lose?" Hank rode up, his horse lathered and blowing. "At least 50 head dead or crippled, maybe more. Fences are destroyed, and we got 4 men wounded, 1 bad." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Vance?" "His men scattered when we started shooting back. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him." "He's getting bold. He's getting desperate," Hank corrected. "That raid we did hurt him more than we thought. This was revenge." Rhett turned to look at the scattered herd, the broken fences, the bodies on the ground. His expression was carved from stone. "It's not over," he said quietly. The next week was spent rebuilding. They buried the dead cattle, mended fences, treated the wounded men. Lena worked alongside everyone else, her hands raw and aching, her body pushed past exhaustion. At night, she collapsed into bed and didn't dream. Rhett's shoulder wasn't healing right. May had to restitch it twice, and he still moved like every motion cost him. But he refused to slow down, refused to rest. He rode the property every day, checking defenses, meeting with the men, making plans. Lena started to understand something about him during those days. Rhett Calder wasn't just stubborn. He was terrified. Terrified of losing the land he'd built. Terrified of failing the people who depended on him. Terrified of letting down the memory of whatever ghost still haunted him. She saw it in the way he stood on the porch at night, staring out at the dark like he was waiting for the next attack. She saw it in the way his hands shook sometimes when he thought no one was looking. She saw it in his eyes. One evening, after another long day of work, Lena found him in the barn. He was sitting on a hay bale, arm in a sling, staring at nothing. She sat down beside him without asking permission. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Rhett said, "I had a son." Lena's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't say anything, just waited. "His name was Daniel. He was 4 years old." Rhett's voice was flat, distant. "Got sick one winter. Fever. My wife Sarah tried everything. I rode for the doctor, but by the time we got back..." He stopped, swallowed. "By the time we got back, Daniel was gone. Sarah followed him 3 days later. Same fever." Lena felt something crack in her chest. "I'm sorry. I built this place for them. For us. Thought if I could carve out something permanent, something safe, they'd be protected." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Didn't matter. You can't protect anyone from everything." "Is that why you bought me?" Lena asked quietly. "Because you couldn't save them?" Rhett looked at her then, and his eyes were raw. "Maybe. I don't know. I just knew that if I let your brother sell you to someone like that man with the gut hanging over his belt, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Stupid reason, probably." "Not stupid. Selfish, then." Lena shook her head. "You gave me a choice, Rhett. You gave me a chance. That's more than selfish." He studied her face, and something in his expression softened. "You could have died out there. During the stampede." "So could you. That's different. Why?" "Because this is my fight, not yours." Lena turned to face him fully. "It became my fight the moment I pulled that trigger to save Carson. The moment I rode into that stampede. You don't get to decide that for me." Rhett opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, very quietly, "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." "Too late. I'm already here." They sat in the quiet barn, the smell of hay and horses around them, and Lena realized that somewhere along the way she'd stopped seeing him as the man who bought her and started seeing him as just a man, flawed and grieving and fighting like hell to hold on to something that kept slipping through his fingers. "What was she like?" Lena asked. "Sarah." Rhett smiled, just a little. "Tough. Tougher than me, probably. She grew up in St. Louis. Came out here with her parents when she was 16. Hated it at first, the dirt, the isolation, all of it. But then she decided she was going to make it work, and once Sarah decided something, he shook his head. There was no stopping her. She sounds like someone I would have liked. You would have. Rhett looked down at his hands. She would have liked you too, would have appreciated the way you don't take shit from anyone. I learned that the hard way. Best way to learn anything. Outside, the sun was setting again, and the sky was on fire. They sat together in the gathering dark, and for the first time since Lena had arrived, she felt like she wasn't alone. The attack came at dawn 2 days later, and this time it wasn't a raid or a stampede. It was war. Lena woke to the sound of gunfire and men shouting. She grabbed her rifle and ran outside to find the ranch under siege. Vance had brought an army, at least 20 men, maybe more, surrounding the property, firing from cover. Rhett's men were scattered, returning fire from behind the barn, the corrals, the main house. Lena dropped behind a water trough and started shooting. The air was thick with gun smoke and noise. Bullets kicked up dirt all around her. Someone screamed. A horse went down, thrashing. She fired, reloaded, fired again. Across the yard, she saw Rhett directing the defense from the porch, his arm still in a sling, but his gun hand steady. He was shouting orders, moving men into position, holding the line. Then one of the outbuildings exploded. The blast knocked Lena sideways, her ears ringing. Fire erupted, spreading fast, catching on the dry wood. Men scrambled to get clear. Vance's men used the confusion to push forward. Lena saw Tom go down, clutching his leg, saw Carson drag him behind cover, saw Hank firing methodically, face grim. And then she saw Vance himself, riding through the chaos with a rifle, heading straight for Rhett. Lena didn't think. She just ran. She sprinted across the open yard, bullets whining past her, and threw herself at Rhett just as Vance fired. They both went down hard, Rhett's injured shoulder slamming into the porch boards. He shouted in pain. The bullet had missed. Rhett shoved Lena off him, scrambled to his feet, and returned fire. Vance's horse reared, and he had to fight to stay mounted. "What the hell are you doing?" Rhett yelled at her. "Saving your life. I told you to stay back. And I didn't listen." More of Vance's men were closing in. The fire was spreading, now engulfing 2 buildings. The smoke was so thick Lena could barely see. Rhett grabbed her arm. "We need to fall back. Get to the main house." They ran, half the crew with them, bullets chasing them the whole way. They slammed through the door and barricaded it with furniture. May was already there, loading guns, her face set in fierce determination. "How many wounded?" Rhett demanded. 3. Tom's the worst." Rhett swore. He moved to the window, looked out. "They're going to try to burn us out." "Let them try," May said. "This house is stone. It won't burn easy." Lena joined him at the window. Outside, Vance's men were regrouping, preparing for another push. She could see Vance himself, sitting on his horse in the middle of it all, giving orders. "We can't hold forever," Carson said from across the room. "We're outnumbered and running low on ammunition." "I know," Rhett said. "So what do we do?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We end this." He turned to Lena. "You're the best shot we have." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking if Vance goes down, his men scatter. They're not loyal, they're hired guns. Without him, they've got no reason to keep fighting." Lena's stomach went cold. "You want me to kill him?" "I want you to end this war before everyone I care about dies." She looked at him, at the desperation in his eyes, at the way he was holding himself together by sheer will. She thought about Tom bleeding on the floor, about the buildings burning outside, about all the people who'd taken her in, fed her, taught her, treated her like she belonged. "All right," she said. Rhett nodded. "There's a window on the second floor, east-facing. You'll have a clear shot from there." May handed her a box of ammunition. "Make it count!" Lena climbed the stairs, her legs shaking, and found the window Rhett had described. She pushed it open and set up, resting the rifle on the sill. Outside, the chaos continued. But she focused on Vance, tracking his movements, waiting for a clear shot. He was smart. He stayed behind his men, kept moving, never still for long. Lena slowed her breathing, forced herself to be patient. And then Vance made a mistake. He rode forward to shout something at his men, and for just a second he was exposed. Lena sighted down the barrel, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. Vance jerked, grabbed his chest, and fell from his horse. For a moment, everything stopped. Then his men started shouting, scrambling, some running to him, others mounting up and riding for cover. Rhett burst out of the house, gun raised, voice like thunder. "It's over! Vance is down! Anyone else wants to die today, step forward." No one did. The hired guns looked at each other, looked at Vance's body on the ground, and started backing away. Within minutes, they were riding off, disappearing into the morning light. Lena lowered the rifle, her hands numb, and just sat there. She'd killed a man. Not in the heat of a fight, not in self-defense. She'd killed him because Rhett had asked her to. She heard footsteps on the stairs, and then Rhett was there, standing in the doorway. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes were clear. "It's done," he said. Lena nodded. She couldn't speak. Rhett crossed the room and took the rifle from her hands, set it aside. Then he sat down beside her, both of them on the floor beneath the window. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For asking you to do that." Lena looked at him. "You didn't force me." "I know, but I asked anyway." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher and the sounds of the ranch slowly returned to normal, men calling to each other, assessing damage, putting out fires. Finally, Lena said, "Is it really over?" "Yeah, it's over." She leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She felt Rhett's hand find hers, their fingers tangling together. And for the first time in her life, Lena Carver felt like she'd fought for something that mattered. The winter that followed was the hardest Lena had ever known. Not because of the cold, though the wind that came down from the mountains could cut through leather and wool like it was nothing. Not because of the work, though there was always more to do, cattle to feed, ice to break on water troughs, firewood to split and stack. It was hard because everything had changed and no one knew how to talk about it. Rhett's shoulder healed slowly, the wound leaving a puckered scar that he couldn't quite hide when he rolled up his sleeves. He moved differently now, favoring that side, though he'd never admit it hurt. The men treated Lena with a careful respect that felt more like distance, like they'd seen her do something they couldn't quite reconcile with who they thought she was. And Lena couldn't stop thinking about the fact that she'd killed 2 men and nearly killed a third. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, seeing that torch fall from the rider's hand, seeing Vance aim at Rhett's back, feeling the kick of the rifle against her shoulder. May found her outside the chicken coop one morning, just standing there with an empty feed bucket, staring at nothing. "You all right, girl?" May asked. Lena blinked. "Yeah, just tired." May studied her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "It's the killing, isn't it?" Lena's throat tightened. She nodded. "First time's always the worst," May said quietly. "Makes you wonder what kind of person you are, that you could do it. Does it get easier?" "No, but you learn to carry it different." May squeezed her shoulder once, then walked back to the house, leaving Lena standing in the cold with that small comfort and nothing else. 3 weeks after the raid, a rider came to the ranch. Not one of Vance's men, someone else. A marshal from the territorial capital, gray-haired and stern, with a badge pinned to his coat and a writ folded in his saddlebag. Rhett met him on the porch, and Lena watched from the barn, pitchfork still in her hands. "You Rhett Calder?" the marshal asked. "I am. I'm here about the incident at the Vance property. You want to tell me your side of it?" Rhett didn't flinch. "Vance sent men to attack my ranch, killed my cattle, tried to burn my land. I defended what's mine." "By raiding his property and burning his barns?" "By making it clear I wouldn't be pushed off my land." The marshal pulled out the writ and unfolded it. "Vance filed a complaint, says you destroyed $20,000 worth of property and killed 3 of his men. Those men died attacking my people first, and I'd do it again." The marshal sighed like he'd heard this story 100 times before. "Look, Calder, I don't care who started what. The territorial governor wants this settled before it turns into a full-scale range war. So here's what's going to happen. You and Vance are going to sit down with a mediator, work out your boundary disputes, and sign an agreement that says you'll leave each other the hell alone. You refuse, and I'll arrest you both for destruction of property and conspiracy to incite violence. Understood?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When?" 2 weeks. Town hall in Red Hollow Bend. Be there or I'll come back with a warrant. The marshal tipped his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode off. Lena set down the pitchfork and walked over. Rhett was still standing on the porch, staring at the dust trail the marshal had left behind. You going? She asked. Don't have much choice. You think Vance will actually negotiate? No. I think he'll use it as an opportunity to make himself look reasonable while painting me as the aggressor. Rhett rubbed his jaw. But if I don't show, the marshal will haul me in, and Vance will get everything he wants by default. So what do you do? Rhett looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. I bring proof. Witnesses. Evidence that Vance started this. You want me to come? I want you to tell them what happened, what you saw. Lena's stomach dropped. Rhett, You saved Carson and Pete. You saw Vance's men attack first. Your testimony matters. I'm a woman who got sold in a saloon. You think anyone's going to believe me? I do. The words were simple, but the weight behind them wasn't. Lena looked at him, at this hard, closed-off man who'd given her a rifle and a year and a chance to prove she was more than what her brothers had made her. All right, she said, I'll do it. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation. Rhett spent hours going over property records, bills of sale, witness statements from the men who'd been there during Vance's attacks. He barely slept, and when he did, Lena could hear him pacing in his room, boots creaking on the floorboards. Carson and Pete agreed to testify. Tom volunteered to come as backup, in case things went sideways. May packed enough food for the journey and muttered under her breath about men and their pride, and how none of this would have happened if people just learned to talk. The night before they were supposed to leave, Lena found Rhett in the barn, checking the horses for the third time. They're fine, she said. I know. Then why are you out here? Rhett didn't answer right away. He ran a hand along his horse's neck, fingers moving through the coarse mane. Because I'm about to walk into a room with the man who tried to kill me and pretend we can settle this with words. You don't think it'll work? I think Vance is a snake, and snakes don't stop biting just because you ask them politely. Lena leaned against the stall door. So why do it at all? Because the alternative is more bloodshed, more men dead, more land burned. He looked at her. And because I'm tired, Lena. I've been fighting for so long I don't remember what it's like not to. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. What happens if this doesn't work? She asked quietly. Then we prepare for the worst. They rode out at dawn. Rhett, Lena, Carson, Pete, and Tom. 5 people on horses, heading back to the town where Lena's brothers had sold her 4 months ago. The closer they got, the tighter Lena's chest became. She hadn't been back since that night in the saloon. Hadn't wanted to. The thought of seeing Cyrus or Eugene made her skin crawl. But she'd made a promise, and she wasn't going to break it. They reached Red Hollow Bend just after noon. The town looked the same. Dusty streets, clapboard buildings, the saloon squatting on the corner like a vulture. Lena kept her eyes forward as they rode past it, but she could feel the weight of memory pressing down on her. The town hall was a squat building at the far end of the main street. A crowd had already gathered outside, townspeople curious about the spectacle, a few reporters with notebooks, and a cluster of men Lena recognized as Vance's crew. Vance himself stood on the steps, talking to a man in a fine suit. He looked exactly as Lena remembered, short, stocky, face red from too much sun or too much whiskey. When he saw Rhett, his expression hardened. Rhett dismounted and handed his reins to Tom. Stay out here. If this goes bad, you ride back and warn Hank. You sure about this, boss? Tom asked. No, but we're doing it anyway. They walked into the town hall, and the crowd followed. Inside, the space had been set up like a makeshift courtroom. A long table at the front where the mediator sat, 2 smaller tables facing it for Rhett and Vance, rows of chairs for witnesses and spectators. The marshal stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching everything. The mediator was an older man, balding, with spectacles perched on his nose. He banged a gavel and called for order. We're here to settle the dispute between Rhett Calder and Samuel Vance regarding property boundaries, alleged trespassing, and destruction of assets. Each party will present their case, and I will render a judgment based on the evidence. Mr. Vance, you filed the initial complaint. You'll go first. Vance stood, smoothing his vest. Thank you, Your Honor. This is a simple case. Rhett Calder has been encroaching on my land for over a year, grazing his cattle on my property, using my water sources. When I confronted him, he threatened me. And when I refused to back down, he led a raid on my ranch, burned my barns, killed my men, and cost me $20,000 in damages. The mediator made a note. Do you have evidence of this encroachment? I do. Vance's lawyer, a slick-looking man with oiled hair, produced a surveyor's map and laid it on the table. This shows the boundary line as established by the Territorial Land Office. As you can see, Mr. Calder's northern fence is a full quarter-mile over the line. Rhett leaned forward, studying the map. That map is from 1869. The boundary was resurveyed in 1871 after the river shifted. I have the updated documents. Convenient, Vance said. It's a matter of public record. The mediator held up a hand. We'll get to your evidence, Mr. Calder. Mr. Vance, do you have witnesses to these alleged trespasses? I do. Vance gestured to two of his men sitting in the front row. They stood and swore they'd seen Rhett's cattle on Vance's land multiple times. Rhett's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. When Vance finished, the mediator turned to Rhett. Your turn, Mr. Calder. Rhett stood, and the room went quiet. He was a head taller than Vance, shoulders broad, presence commanding even when he wasn't trying. Everything Vance just said is a lie, Rhett began. I've never encroached on his land. I've never threatened him. What I did do was defend my property when he sent armed men to attack it. He pulled out a stack of papers. These are the updated survey documents showing the correct boundary line. These are sworn statements from my men describing the attacks. And these, he laid down a series of photographs, are pictures of the damage Vance's men did to my fences, my cattle, my land. The mediator studied the documents. And the raid on Mr. Vance's property was retaliation after his men tried to kill two of mine. Do you have witnesses to that attack? I do. Carson Hayes and Pete Lawson were there, and so was Lena Carver. Every head in the room turned toward Lena. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she stood up. The mediator gestured for her to come forward. She walked to the front, acutely aware of every eye on her. Vance was staring at her with open contempt. Rhett gave her a small nod. Miss Carver, the mediator said, you witnessed the attack Mr. Calder is describing? Yes, sir. Tell me what you saw. Lena took a breath. I was checking a water trough on the eastern pasture when I heard gunfire from the northern fence line. I rode over and saw 4 men attacking Carson and Pete. They had them pinned down behind a wagon, and one of them had a torch. I fired my rifle and hit 2 of the attackers. Carson and Pete returned fire and drove off the rest. And you're certain these men were working for Mr. Vance? One of them was wearing a vest with Vance's brand stitched on it. Vance shot to his feet. That's a lie. It's the truth, Carson said from the back of the room. I saw it too. The mediator banged his gavel. Mr. Vance, sit down. Vance sat, but his face was purple with rage. The mediator turned back to Lena. Miss Carver, one more question. What is your relationship to Mr. Calder? Lena hesitated. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in, waiting for her answer. I work for him, she said. As what? Ranch hand. Vance's lawyer stood. Your Honor, I'd like to question the credibility of this witness. Miss Carver is not employed in any legal capacity. In fact, according to my records, she was purchased by Mr. Calder in this very town 4 months ago for $350. The room erupted. People were shouting, the marshal was calling for order, and Lena felt like the floor had opened up beneath her. She looked at Rhett, and his face was stone. The mediator banged his gavel until the noise died down. Is this true, Mr. Calder? Rhett stood. Yes. And Miss Carver is still in your employ under those terms? No, she's working off the debt. When it's paid, she's free to leave. Vance's lawyer smiled. So she's an indentured servant, which means her testimony is compromised. She'll say whatever Mr. Calder wants her to say. That's not true, Lena said, voice shaking. I'm telling you what I saw. Or what you were told to say. No one tells me what to say. The lawyer ignored her and turned to the mediator. Your Honor, this witness has no credibility. Her entire livelihood depends on Mr. Calder. Of course she'll lie for him. Lena's hands were trembling with rage. I'm not lying. Then prove it. Show us this vest you claim to have seen. I didn't take it. I was too busy keeping your boss's men from killing people. Convenient. Rhett stepped forward. That's enough. Is it, Mr. Calder? Because it seems to me you've built your entire defense on the word of a woman you own. I don't own her. You bought her. There's a bill of sale with your signature on it. Rhett's jaw worked. The bill of sale was to get her out of a bad situation. She's not property. Then why does she still work for you? Because she chooses to. Vance's lawyer laughed. Choices made under duress aren't choices, Mr. Calder. They're just survival. The words hit Lena like a slap. Because they were true. She had chosen to stay, but only because the alternative was worse. The mediator was watching her, and she could see the doubt in his eyes. Miss Carver, he said gently, do you feel coerced into testifying today? Lena looked at Rhett, at his scarred shoulder, at the exhaustion carved into his face, at the man who'd given her a rifle and a year and a chance to be something other than what her brothers had made her. No, she said. I'm here because what I saw matters, and because Vance's men tried to kill people I care about. People you care about, or people you're obligated to protect? Both. The mediator sighed. I'm sorry, Miss Carver, but I can't give full weight to your testimony under these circumstances. It's too compromised. Lena felt something inside her crack. She'd stood up here, told the truth, and it didn't matter. Because she was still just a woman who'd been sold. She turned and walked back to her seat, throat tight. The hearing dragged on for another hour. The mediator reviewed the evidence, asked more questions, listened to more arguments, but Lena could see the way it was going. Without her testimony, it came down to Rhett's word against Vance's, and Vance had the better lawyers. Finally, the mediator banged his gavel. I've heard enough. Here's my ruling. The boundary line will be resurveyed by an independent third party within 30 days. Until then, both parties will cease all activity within a quarter-mile buffer zone on either side of the disputed border. As for the raids, Mr. Calder, you'll pay Mr. Vance $5,000 in restitution for the destroyed barns. Mr. Vance, you'll pay Mr. Calder $2,000 for the damaged fences and cattle. Both of you will sign an agreement to cease hostilities immediately. If either of you violates this agreement, I'll have the marshal arrest you. Understood? Rhett's face was unreadable. Understood. Vance smiled. Understood, Your Honor. The gavel banged again, and it was over. They walked out of the town hall into the fading afternoon light. The crowd dispersed, already gossiping about what they'd seen. Lena stood on the steps, feeling numb. Carson came up beside her. That was bullshit. Doesn't matter, Lena said. It's done. You told the truth. That should count for something. It didn't. Rhett was standing by the horses, talking to Tom in a low voice. When he saw Lena, he walked over. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For putting you through that. I thought your testimony would make a difference. So did I. They stood there in the dusty street, and Lena realized she was angrier than she'd been in months. Not at Rhett, at Vance, at his lawyer, at the mediator, at the whole damn system that said her word didn't matter because of how she'd ended up here. I want to go home, she said. Rhett nodded. Let's go. They rode out of Red Hollow Bend as the sun set, painting the sky red and gold. Lena didn't look back. The ride home took 2 days and no one talked much. Rhett was quiet, lost in whatever calculations he was making about how to pay Vance the restitution without bankrupting the ranch. Carson and Pete were sullen, angry at the ruling. Tom kept glancing at Lena like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. When they finally crested the ridge and saw the ranch spread out below them, Lena felt something loosen in her chest. Home. She hadn't meant to think of it that way, but there it was. They rode down into the valley as dusk settled in. May was waiting on the porch, and the moment she saw them, she knew. Didn't go well? She called. Could have gone worse, Rhett said, dismounting. He handed her a piece of paper, the agreement he'd signed. We've got a buffer zone and a bill to pay, but at least we're not at war. May scanned the document, lips pressed thin. $5,000. I know. How are we going to I'll figure it out. May looked like she wanted to argue, but she just nodded and went inside. Lena unsaddled her horse and led her to the corral. The familiar routine steadied her, loosen the straps, lift the saddle, check the hooves, brush down the coat. By the time she was done, the The stars were out. She walked to her cabin, lit the lantern, and sat on the cot. The past 4 months played through her mind like a fever dream. The saloon, the ride to the ranch, the first time she'd picked up a rifle, the raid, the hearing, all of it leading to this moment. Sitting alone in a cabin that wasn't hers, on land that wasn't hers, in a life that wasn't hers. Except it was starting to feel like maybe it could be. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," Lena said. Rhett stepped inside, hat in his hands. He looked older in the lamplight, worn down. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Sure." He sat in the single chair, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Rhett said, "I've been thinking about what Vance's lawyer said, about choices under duress." Lena's stomach tightened. "Rhett, let me finish." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When I bought you, I told myself I was helping, that I was giving you a better option than whatever those other men in that saloon would have done. But the truth is, I needed help and you needed a way out, and I took advantage of that." "You gave me a choice," Lena said. "A year of work, then freedom. That's more than most people would have done." "It's not enough." Rhett pulled something from his coat pocket and held it out. "The bill of sale." Lena stared at it. "I'm tearing this up," Rhett said. "Right now, you don't owe me anything. You're free to leave whenever you want." Lena's heart was hammering. "What if I don't want to leave?" Rhett looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "Then you stay, not because you have to, because you choose to." He tore the bill of sale in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall to the floor. Lena watched them scatter like ash. 4 months of her life, reduced to scraps of paper. "I choose to stay," she said. Rhett nodded slowly. "Why?" "Because this is the first place I've ever felt like I mattered." The words hung in the air between them, raw and true. Rhett stood, and for a moment Lena thought he was going to leave. Instead, he held out his hand. She took it. His grip was warm, calloused, steady. "Then you're part of this," he said. "Not as hired help. As a partner." Lena felt something shift in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for so long it hurt to let it go. "All right," she said. "Partner?" Rhett smiled, just a small curve of his mouth, but it was the first real smile she'd ever seen from him. He let go of her hand and walked to the door, paused. "One more thing." "What?" "Thank you for what you did at the hearing, even if it didn't change the outcome." "I told the truth, that's all. It's more than most people do." He left, and Lena sat alone in the lamplight, staring at the torn pieces of the bill of sale on the floor. She picked them up, one by one, and threw them into the cold stove. Then she lay down on the cot and slept deeper than she had in months. The winter passed, and with it, the worst of the tension. The buffer zone held. Vance kept to his side, Rhett kept to his. The independent surveyor came and confirmed that Rhett's boundary line was correct, and Vance's lawyer went silent. Rhett paid the restitution by selling off part of the herd and tightening the budget. It hurt, but the ranch survived. And Lena stayed. She worked the land like she owned it, because in a way she did. Rhett started asking her opinion on things. Which pastures to rotate, how to handle a stubborn horse, whether to hire new hands. May taught her to cook more than just basic trail food. Carson and Tom stopped treating her like an outsider and started treating her like crew. Spring came, and with it, new calves and longer days and the smell of sage carried on the wind. One evening, Lena was sitting on the porch of the main house, mending a bridle, when Rhett came out and sat beside her. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "Next as in tomorrow, or next as in the rest of my life?" "The rest of your life." Lena set down the bridle. "Sometimes." "Why?" Rhett was quiet for a moment, staring out at the valley. "Because I've spent the last 5 years just trying to survive, and I'm tired of it. I want to build something that lasts." "You already have." "Not just the ranch. Something more." He turned to look at her, and Lena saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. Hope. "I'm not good at this," Rhett said, "talking about what I feel. But the truth is you've changed things here. Changed me. And I don't want you to leave. Not in a year. Not ever." Lena's breath caught. "Rhett, I'm not asking you to marry me. Not yet. But I'm asking if you'd consider staying, not as a partner in the ranch, as a partner in everything." Lena looked at him, at this hard, scarred man who'd bought her and freed her and given her a place to belong. "Yes," she said. Rhett smiled, and it was the kind of smile that broke through years of grief and loss and loneliness. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. They sat there on the porch as the sun set, painting the land in shades of gold and red, and Lena felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died. Peace. A year later, on a clear autumn day, Rhett and Lena stood on that same porch and got married. It was a small ceremony, just the ranch hands, May, a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. No fancy dress, no flowers, no fuss. Just two people choosing each other in front of the land they'd built together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Rhett kissed her, and the men cheered, and May cried into her apron. Afterward, they had a meal on long tables set up in the yard. Roasted beef, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, pie made with apples from the trees Lena had planted that spring. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, Tom raised a glass. To Rhett and Lena, who proved that the strongest foundations are built on choice, not obligation. Everyone drank to that. Later, when the party had wound down and the men had drifted off to the bunkhouse, Lena and Rhett stood alone in the yard. "You happy?" Rhett asked. "Yeah," Lena said. "I am." "Good, because I plan on keeping you that way." "That a promise?" "That's a vow." He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Above them, the stars stretched out forever, cold and bright. And Lena thought about the girl who'd stood in a saloon 4 years ago, bound and sold and certain she'd never be free. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned to shoot straight, work hard, and choose her own life. A woman who'd found a home not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd earned it. A woman who'd been bought, then freed, then chosen, and in the choosing, she'd become unbreakable. 6 months later, Lena stood in the bedroom of the main house, one hand pressed to her stomach, feeling the flutter of new life growing inside her. She walked to the window and looked out at the land, at the fences she'd helped mend, the cattle grazing in the distance, the mountains rising up like sentinels against the sky. Behind her, Rhett came in, saw her standing there, and crossed the room to wrap his arms around her. "You all right?" he asked. "Better than all right." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Scared?" "Terrified." "Me too." They stood there together, looking out at the ranch, at the life they'd built from nothing but stubbornness and sweat, and the refusal to give up. "We're going to be good at this," Rhett said quietly. "How do you know?" "Because we've already survived everything else." Lena smiled and covered his hands with hers. Outside, the wind carried the smell of sage and dust and coming rain, and in the distance a hawk circled, wings spread wide against the endless blue. Lena closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, the baby moving in her belly, the solid warmth of Rhett behind her. This was home. This was family. This was the life she'd chosen, and no one could ever take it away.